At 10:59 in the morning on the 11th of November 1918, an American private named Henry Gunther charged a German machine gun position in northern France. He was 23 years old and the son of German immigrants. He had been demoted 3 weeks earlier for writing a letter home that the army called unpatriotic. He was trying to earn his rank back. The Germans saw him coming. They tried to wave him off, but he kept running, so they opened fire. Henry Gunther died 60 seconds before the war he was fighting in officially ended. The armistice had been signed at 5 in the morning. Both sides knew, and the order was sitting on his commander's desk. In the 6 hours between the signing and the ceasefire taking effect, 11,000 soldiers died. Some commanders ordered attacks because they wanted to go out victorious. Some pushed for ground that would look good in post-war memoirs. And the actual reason 11,000 boys had to die in those 6 hours, the real reason, might be the worst part of all. But we'll come back to that. For tonight's episode, the oldest lie ever told, sold to every generation that ever held a rifle. Every war ever fought has been sold to its citizens with the same three words: defense, honor, freedom. Sometimes the words are dressed up: spreading democracy, protecting our way of life, defending the homeland, or holy duty, or even manifest destiny. But peel back those layers, and underneath you'll find one of three things: resources, territory, or the personal ambitions of a small number of people. Every single time. There is no exception in human history. The principles are the marketing. The wars get fought because somebody made the math, and the math said war was profitable. In 2022, Edward Berger directed an adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front. The novel's 100 years old now, but the story is simple. A class of German teenagers in 1917 get whipped into patriotic fervor by their school teacher. They enlist, then die in the mud, one by one calling out for their mothers. But what that 2022 film does that the book couldn't is that it cuts repeatedly between the trenches and the railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. In the carriage, the German High Command is negotiating the armistice. They're warm, there's coffee, croissants, and there's a pen that two diplomats are wrestling over because neither wants to be the one whose signature ends the war Germany lost. Outside the carriage, in the trenches, the boys are still dying by the bushel. Because the war just hasn't ended yet. And in the film's most unforgivable scene, the one I genuinely had to pause and walk away from, a German general, in the final hours before the ceasefire, orders one last assault. 11 o'clock is when the war ends. He orders his troops over the top at 10:45. For the honor of Germany, he says. He sends them anyway, knowing they will die for nothing. And they do. They die for 15 minutes of ground that is given back the next day. The men who make the decisions never bleed in the wars they make. That sentence is the entire history of warfare in one line. From Caesar's legions, to Genghis Khan's hordes, to the British Empire, to today's drone strikes. It's the same equation. Old men in war rooms decide, while young men in cold mud die. And the principles they sell? They are, every single time, things old men in warm rooms invented to make young men in cold mud feel like their deaths meant something. In 1731, a British smuggler named Robert Jenkins had his ears sliced off by a Spanish coast guard. Or, so he claimed. Some historians think it may have actually been a different ear. It doesn't really matter. What matters is what happened 7 years later. In 1738, the British politicians were looking for an excuse to break a Spanish trade monopoly that was costing British merchants money. Somebody dug up the Jenkins story. The captain was paraded into the British Parliament. He had supposedly preserved the ear in a glass jar. He held it up. Members of the Parliament wept. The Spanish have wounded the honor of the empire, they said. And so Britain went to war. The conflict was eventually called the War of Jenkins' Ear. It killed approximately 35,000 human beings over a severed ear that may not have been severed, that had been sitting in a jar for 7 years. used as a pretext by men who wanted to break a tariff, to convince a country that going to war was the honorable thing to do. In Game of Thrones, there's a line that stuck with me ever since I first heard it.
Wars have been started for less.
And that line lands as cynicism, but it's actually history. Reading the actual record of human conflict, you realize that line is an understatement. Most wars were started for less than the Jenkins example. Some were started over insults at dinner. Some were started because a king's nephew didn't get invited to a wedding. Some were started because two cousins both wanted the same crown. And in every case, the principles were invented afterwards to make the deaths sound noble. Now bring it forward. February 2022, the Russian government invades Ukraine. The stated principle, repeated for years afterwards in state media, is the protection of Russian-speaking populations in eastern Ukraine, or denazification, or defense against NATO encroachment. These are the principles, spoken in serious tones by men in suits behind ornate desks. As of recording in spring 2026, 4 years in, Russia has lost over 1 million soldiers, killed and wounded. Some estimates put the dead at over 500,000. Ukraine has lost between 250 and 300,000. Ukrainian civilian deaths confirmed by the UN exceed 15,000, almost certainly an undercount. 10 million Ukrainians displaced. The war is the largest in Europe since 1945. And the actual reasons? Strip away the principles and you find the personal legacy ambitions of one man who has been in power for 25 years. The strategic value of Ukraine's grain ports and gas pipelines. The need for an external enemy to consolidate domestic support. The fear of a successful democracy on Russia's borders, encouraging the same thing inside Russia. None of these reasons would have moved a single soldier to the front. So they were sold defense. They were sold honor. They were sold a story about brothers being threatened, when the truth is, somebody in a warm room calculated that war was useful. And while the boys die in trenches that look almost identical to 1917, the people who made the decision are alive. They're well. They're eating in nice restaurants. They will never see what they ordered. Or closer to home for some of you watching this. In the West Philippine Sea, Chinese Coast Guard ships have been ramming and water cannoning Filipino fishing boats and resupply vessels for years. As of last year, China built a floating barricade across the entrance to Scarborough Shoal, which sits squarely inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, recognized as such by international law. They've fired water cannons that injured Filipino sailors. They've collided with Filipino vessels. They've harassed humanitarian missions resupplying the rusting hulk of the BRP Sierra Madre. And every time it happens, China's foreign ministry says the same thing. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, the historic rights of the Chinese people. These are the principles. The actual reason is that the West Philippine Sea sits on top of an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and carries more than $3 trillion in shipping every year. That is what's worth ramming a Filipino fisherman over. Paul Bomber, the protagonist, an 18-year-old German boy, has just stabbed a French soldier in a shell crater. They are alone. The Frenchman is bleeding out slowly. Paul realizes it's too late, that he's killed a man who was just trying to take cover. Same as him. He pulls out the man's wallet. Photos, a wife, a daughter. Paul cries. He apologizes, tries to bandage the wound, and he tells the dying man that he never wanted this. That if they had met anywhere else, they would have been probably friends. The soldier dies, and Paul is alone in the crater with the body. And outside, the artillery is still going. And somewhere in a warm room, a man with a map is deciding whether to push for another 100 meters of mud. That scene is the truth of every war ever fought. Just two scared boys in a hole, one of them holding the other while he dies. Both of them having no idea why. And the genius of the 2022 film is that it cuts from that crater straight back to the railway carriage, where the men deciding everything are pouring more coffee. Henry Gunther died at 10:59 a.m. on November 11, 1918, 60 seconds before the armistice took effect. His last commanding officer wrote a letter to his mother. He told her that Henry died bravely, charging the enemy. He did not mention that Henry had been demoted 3 weeks earlier for telling the truth in a letter home. He did not mention that the Germans had tried to wave him off. He told her Henry had died for his country. That is what every letter says to every mother in every war. Because the alternative is a truth too heavy to carry. And the principles, they were the language we developed as a species to make the math of human sacrifice add up. There's another war, and the principle gets repackaged, and the cycle continues. That is what the war is about. That has always been what war is about. And every time someone tells you otherwise, they are selling you the same wrapping paper that was sold to Henry Gunther's mother in 1918. Don't buy it. That's Devil's Midnight Thesis. Think responsibly. Or better yet, take responsibility.